It's funny how a neighborhood can feel so quiet and settled for years, then suddenly everything changes overnight. That's exactly what happened when the house directly north of mine got sold. Up until then, life was calm, almost boring in the best way. Families waving hello, kids playing on weekends, the usual stuff. But once the new neighbors moved in, I swear, it was like someone flipped a switch. I remember the first sign of trouble was one early Saturday morning. I just poured myself a cup of coffee, enjoying the sunrise, when I noticed a bunch of workers showing up right at the property line. They started cutting down these big old trees, really majestic ones that had been there forever, casting this peaceful shade over our yards. The new owners later said the trees were blocking sunlight, but honestly, to me, those trees were part of the neighborhood's charm. It felt like they didn't even consider asking anyone or checking local rules before just taking a chainsaw to decades of growth. Next thing, the fence went up. Now, I'm not one for being overly strict about garden decor, but there are codes here: maximum fence height, type, placement, all that. Their fence? It was 2 feet taller than what's allowed. And not just a sneaky little extra inch, it was obvious. The top of the fence stood there, almost looming, cutting through the light in my backyard in a way that hadn't happened before. I called the city when I noticed, thinking maybe they just didn't realize, but I didn't hold my breath that anything would change right away. Then, to add a little twist, they planted these tall saplings right on the borderline, again citing the need for privacy and, of course, sunlight. These trees blocked even more light, especially in the late afternoon when my garden used to bask in that warm glow. I asked politely if they could move them a couple feet over, respecting the boundary a bit more, but I was met with silence or vague excuses. It was like they didn't see the point in playing by the unwritten rules that had kept everyone here friendly for so long. I have to say, at first I tried to brush it off. Maybe it's just new owners who don't know the neighborhood's rhythm yet. But as days went by, this quiet encroachment kept setting off this knot of tension in my stomach. It wasn't about the trees or fences alone. It was the message behind it, like they were staking a claim and saying, "We don't care about the way things have always been." The strangest part was how the other neighbors seemed to retreat, avoiding any confrontation or even conversation. Maybe they felt the same way I did but didn't want to get involved. That left me standing there, watching this slow invasion reshaping not just my yard but the whole feel of where I live. I remember thinking, if this is how it starts, I wonder how far it could go. That silence, the disregard for rules, and the refusal to discuss anything set the stage for what was to come. And believe me, it didn't stop with just fences and trees. What happened next pushed things from mere annoyances into outright clashes. It wasn't like problems just sprang up overnight after the new neighbors moved in. At first, everything seemed fine. Polite hellos, the usual nods across the street. But slowly things started to feel off. It began with that garden shed. I noticed it one morning just standing there right on the borderline between our yards. It wasn't just close, it was practically half on my side. I had always been meticulous about that property line. When I bought the house, I spent extra just to get the boundary markers surveyed and clearly set. I thought having that little buffer was important to keep peace, sure, but also to respect privacy. So when I saw that shed, I felt this immediate jolt. I called over the owner, trying to be calm and reasonable. "Hey, I don't think that's quite on your side. We agreed to keep an eye on the line." But they just shrugged it off, all casual-like, and said, "Well, it doesn't really matter, does it? It's just a shed." I remember thinking, no, it does matter. Because to me, that shed wasn't just a structure, it was a sign. A boundary had been disrespected, and I wasn't going to let it slide. So I asked them politely to remove it or at least move it back. They gave a tight smile and said they'd look into it. But I had this sinking feeling they weren't going to budge. Then came the demands. Out of nowhere, a letter slid under my door demanding that I remove an old stone wall that bordered our yards. That wall was like a family heirloom to me. Hand-built by the previous owners, an almost silent guardian marking where my property stopped. The thought of tearing it down felt like erasing part of my history. And if that wasn't enough, they started complaining about my chickens and that rooster I had, saying they were noisy and that livestock wasn't welcome in the neighborhood. I thought, wait, this isn't a farm, it's a quiet little street, yes. But come on, my chickens have been here longer than you have. Still, I received this demand to get rid of them. At that point, I knew this wasn't just about property lines or noise. This was about control, about pushing me out of my space bit by bit. So when I saw them in the driveway one afternoon confidently saying, "You need to move that wall and get rid of the animals," I didn't hold back. I stood my ground. Calmly but firmly told them this was my property, my history, my peace. "I respect your space and expect the same," I said. The words hung in the air, tense but clear. There was a flicker in their eyes, maybe surprise, maybe frustration, but they didn't back down. Neither did I. That day, I felt something shift. A sort of quiet war had begun at the borders of our properties. A war fought not with weapons but with words, walls, and shadows cast by sheds and branches. And while anger simmered beneath the surface, I also realized I had to be smart about this. Getting drawn into constant shouting matches wouldn't solve anything. So I started thinking, if they wanted a fight, fine, but I wasn't just going to throw punches blindly. I had to find a way to respond that was clever, that reclaimed my sense of control without crossing lines myself. Facing these invasive demands, honestly, legal action crossed my mind. I even looked up local ordinances that afternoon, just to see where their rights ended and mine began. But courts and lawyers? They're slow and expensive, and this felt too personal to just hand over to someone else. No, I needed something different, something unexpected. A way to push back without losing myself in hostility. At that moment it hit me, I had to think outside the box, maybe even use a bit of strategy. Because this border wasn't just a line on a map anymore. It was a battleground, and I wasn't going to lose it quietly. I remember the moment I realized that playing by the usual rules just wasn't going to cut it anymore. Sure, I tried talking it out, even consulted the HOA guidelines and local ordinances, but the new neighbors weren't budging. Their blatant disregard for our agreed boundaries and their carelessness with the sunlight, blocking it and leaning over fences into my yard, felt like a silent invasion. But I wasn't about to escalate this with lawyers or loud confrontations. No, I wanted something smarter, quieter, and frankly more satisfying. So I did my homework. I looked into any legal ways I could push back without overstepping, and that's when I stumbled upon something interesting: the Paulownia tree. I'd never heard of it before, but it turns out these trees grow incredibly fast, like ridiculously fast, with wide leafy canopies that can really block the sunlight after just a few years. Perfect, right? And since there's nothing in the neighborhood rules against planting trees along your property line, it was a totally legitimate move. I was literally going to use nature to fight nature. I ordered a handful of Paulownia saplings and had them planted right on my side of the border, clustered strategically where the neighbor's house was practically soaking up the sun at my expense. It felt like a quiet, calculated retaliation that didn't scream conflict, but would gradually and naturally change the entire dynamic. Best part? Since the neighbors themselves had already crossed the line by encroaching on sunlight and, effectively, live with a fence that wasn't their own, I wasn't just planting trees. I was planting what was, in essence, a mirror move. If they thought they could play fast and loose with the rules, then I'd play by rules they didn't expect. Every day, I'd watch those tiny saplings stretch taller and wider, imagining the slow shadow they'd cast over their property. It wasn't about immediate payback but setting this quiet, looming presence that would make them reconsider their attitude. And knowing how much they loved their sunlight and open feel, it was a subtle form of retribution they couldn't ignore. At neighborhood barbecues or casual chats, I kept it light, never mentioning the tree's real purpose, just bragging about how fast these things grew, casually dropping details about their dense shade. I was planting more than trees. I was planting patience and precision. This wasn't a shouting match. It was a slow crescendo where the neighborhood's sun-drenched peace would meet the reality of natural boundaries pushed back. Sure, the fight would take years to play out fully, but I knew the payoff would be worth it. It was almost poetic how that stretch of earth between us, the exact spot they disrespected, would turn green and thick, silently undoing their selfishness one leaf at a time. Looking back, I don't regret waiting, don't regret choosing subtlety over aggression. The trees had become my quiet soldiers, and as their shadows began to stretch, I watched the neighbors' confidence wane just a little each day. It was a reminder that sometimes you don't need noise or confrontation to win a fight. You just need to be smart enough to let nature do the hard work. At that moment, it hit me how the slow, inevitable consequences of what I'd set in motion were going to challenge their arrogance in ways they hadn't imagined. And honestly, that was only the beginning of the quiet war we were about to wage over borders and sunlight. It's funny how something as simple as a tree can turn into your quiet ally in a long, drawn-out conflict. When those Paulownia saplings first took root by the fence line, I didn't pay them much mind. I mean, sure, I noticed them growing fast, but I didn't expect them to become my little soldiers in this neighborhood dispute. You have to understand the backstory to appreciate this. Before those trees got tall and shady, the neighbors, the ones who moved in with a total disregard for the unwritten rules of the neighborhood, had already made my life kind of miserable. They trimmed my bushes without asking, parked in front of my driveway, and generally treated the shared spaces like they were their personal playground. And the moment those Paulownias hit their stride, that was the tipping point. At first, the neighbors tried to complain about the trees. They said the shade was ruining their garden, blocking the sunlight their flowers needed to bloom. I remember one particularly tense afternoon when Mrs. Clarkson came over, arms crossed, tapping her foot impatiently. "These trees are out of control," she said, staring up at the thickening canopy that had started to stretch comfortably over the property line. "You're blocking all the sun. It's just not right." I could have gotten defensive, but I just nodded and smiled. You see, the truth, irrefutable and slow-moving, was on my side. The Paulownia trees had been planted entirely on my property, far from any border lines they wanted to challenge. And they grew fast, faster than the old elms and maples around the neighborhood. Those trees didn't just grow, they thrived. Each morning their long leaves stretched further, their branches weaving a natural curtain of shade that made the neighbors' complaints sound more like sour grapes than legitimate concerns. What felt even better was knowing their earlier infractions left them with no ground to contest what the trees were now doing naturally. They had broken the first rules, taking liberties with shared fences and property lines, and now nature was doing a little bit of the same to them. Their windows, once flooded with warm sunlight, now faced a dark leafy canopy. Their colorful flower beds, which they boasted about at the last neighborhood barbecue, started wilting from lack of light. And every time they came knocking with another demand, the look on their faces told me they felt powerless, trapped by their own choices. I won't lie, there was a part of me that enjoyed watching this slow and steady change. It wasn't about revenge in the usual sense, not the shouting matches or slamming doors kind. It was subtle, almost meditative, like watching time correct a wrong through something as simple as plants growing tall and wide. Instead of fighting back in anger, I chose patience, and the trees became my way of letting the neighborhood dispute settle itself. Neighbors started to rethink their alliance too. Some pulled back from the petty complaints, realizing that escalation only worsened the tension. Others came over with gardening tools, offering help trimming branches and even planting some new flowers tangled safely in patches where sunlight still managed to break through. Peace returned, but it was a quiet peace. The once tense border lines between properties blurred under layers of leaves and shadow, and what began as a quiet war had finally found a natural resolution. Looking back, it taught me something important. Sometimes the best way to win a battle is not to fight it head-on, but to let time and a little cleverness do the work for you. It's a lesson in patience and subtlety that I won't forget anytime soon, especially when I see those Paulownias standing tall, steady sentinels in the fading afternoon light. And that's when it hit me. The story wasn't just about fences or sunlight at all. It was a reminder of how quiet strength and patience could resolve disputes where aggression only makes everything